Hello, my book butterflies, and welcome to the next episode of Fiction Addiction. In this episode, we are going to be going over the Scorch Trials, and then later in the video, I'll be talking about the Death Cure. So, just to begin, if you haven't already watched my first video about the Maze Runner Book 1, or if you haven't even read the first Maze Runner book, I totally recommend it before you start watching this video. So save this to your watch later playlist and come back later. For those of you who are still here, let's talk about the Scorch Trials. So one of the things that I didn't get to say in the last episode, because it would have been more of like a spoiler, is that the Maze Runner series in the second and the third book becomes more of like a zombie book, in the sense that, a brief trigger warning, once they escape the maze and sadly Chuck is dead, they get out and into like the real world, and they see what this world has really like almost come to at this point. And there's the people who are infected with the flare, and there's the people who aren't infected with the flare. And the people who do have the flare, it's a highly contagious disease, and it basically eats your brain from the inside out. But before it does, it makes you go like super slowly crazy. And some characters are immune to it, some characters aren't. And it's interesting to see it as almost like if 10 people were just immune to the zombie apocalypse, how would they manage to save the rest of humanity? So it does become that way in a science fiction novel. I still think it fits into that genre though. And it's interesting as this book really is more so about how do these characters actually take what they've learned in the maze and then interact with people from there. In the Death Cure, they move on from that point, and this is just more like the final wrap-up book. However, I will say, with no spoilers, this book is depressing. Like, it's a good book. It's the perfect way to end the series, but it's almost like the story itself is inherently sad, so the only way to end that series would be with a sad ending. That's the only way that this story could really receive closure. And yet, like I mentioned in the first episode of this series, both of these books are super duper funny. The humor is a little bit more dry, but it's also really, really witty in the second and the third book. It starts to kind of pick up, and I think that's to try and like counterbalance the like depressingness of some of the elements to this story, because it is kind of a sad story. Lots of new characters in both of these books. I was surprised because I thought that the Maze Runner, since it was like 30 to 40 boys locked in like one situation, I was like, great, we're stuck with these 6 bozos for like the rest of the story. I want something new. And like, I got something new, so it was awesome. But it's an interesting story, and it definitely continues on with just that whole overarching theme of like, at the end of the day, if you strip us of our morals, what really are we? And the difference between fantasy and science fiction is, on one hand, you have fantasy, and that's almost like evil can be born. And that if you talk about like Lord of the Rings with the Eye of Sauron and things like that, or with Harry Potter and Dementors, or Harry Potter and Voldemort, where things are just naturally evil, whereas in science fiction novels, it's almost like evil is made, and it comes from maybe not inherently evil people, but can be created and can become an inherently evil thing. And it's really interesting to see Maze Runner kind of almost dance over that line, where there are characters that make you really want to be like, oof, they're evil, and yet it's almost like every single character that James Dashner, the author, creates has at least one redeeming quality and has like 3 negative. And I will say some of the characters are a lot better than the other ones, where they're like, not better, but just not evil compared to a lot of the other characters. And yet none of them have that weird god complex that we see in the first Maze Runner stories, with Thomas kind of taking this role as someone who's maybe like a little bit more OP. And we kind of see more of his humanity show as a literal like 16-year-old boy. But fantastic, super interesting. I will say that these two books are more romantic than the first book. I won't tell you why, but just some love triangle elements, and then from there it moves on to other things. It's weird, almost like a lot of the science fiction novels that I've read that have romance in them almost do it in like a weird way, where it's like, especially if the main character is a woman, where they're like, I can't be a woman and a scientist at the same time, Jared. Like, it's weird. And yet in this book, it's almost like one of those things, like, is being in love with people, is that something that comes from our society, or is that something that comes from a feeling like deep within us that's just natural? And it's so interesting that it's like, it almost like plays with the idea that most of the reason that we like people and that we experience romantic attraction is because society tells us to. And I think that that's really interesting as well. New to reading, or even if you've never heard of this concept before, I would 110% recommend getting yourself a journal that you can write and put your own book journal doodles in it. And what's in a book journal for me is I have a page for a giant list of genres and all the book genres I'm willing to read and that I like to read. And then I label it by what month it is and then the date. And then I write down the book title, and I write down the author, and I write down my own personal rating. And then I write down the favorite line I had, and then just a random line, which usually comes from, like, this is a book I just finished that I'll be reviewing later on, where I tag it. And then I find my favorite tag, and then I just choose a random tag. And that's usually how I rate them on the blog. And that's how I usually like use to sum up kind of almost like the vibe that the book has as a whole, and usually it works pretty well. But according to my handy dandy little book journal, the Scorch Trials, which is the sequel to Maze Runner, I personally decided to give 4.7, which compared to the original novel, Maze Runner, which I gave a 4.8, I think that that's pretty good for a sequel, because usually they go down a lot more than that. But I will say The Death Cure, I just don't like sad books. Does that make sense? Like, usually it's not my thing, but I really, really love this series. So it was worth it for me to read it. And I think that any book that's over a 4-star review is always worth your time to read. And I gave this book a 4.2. And that's it for this review. If you would like to see more series come out later, I'm going to be reviewing the whole Roald Dahl series before April. And thank you for watching. Don't forget to go on over to our blog and recommend a book. We are always taking recommendations. There's 3 other book reviewers, and then I take their reviews and I give them. And then I personally specialize in science fiction and historical fiction, but I'm open to anything, including webtoons and fanfic. So yeah, have a lovely day, guys, and goodbye!